Dragon Age 2. Dragon Age 2 is an interactive cave management simulator made by BioWare and released in March of 2011. In it, you play as a character named Hawk. Hawk and his or her friends live in a cave in the wilderness, and over the course of the game you have to drive out several different types of monsters who invade your cave for various reasons. In between driving out these monsters and unlocking new sections of your cave to explore, you also have the opportunity to complete several side quests in the surrounding countryside and the nearby city of Kirkwall. Now at this point, you may expect me to go into great detail about all the things I didn't like about the game, but I don't have much new to add here that hasn't been covered by practically the entire internet by now. So instead of complaining, I'm going to try something new, which I call reverse complaining. In reverse complaining, instead of complaining, you do whatever the opposite of complaining is. I'm not sure there's a word for it. Bear with me here because I've never done this before. Here's why I'm doing this. If you're like me, and you're always right about everything, one of the most frustrating things you can encounter is when someone else is criticizing the same thing you are, but they're criticizing it wrong. It's important for everyone to recognize that my criticisms are the only valid ones. After I finished Dragon Age 2 and headed to the internet to have the ceremonial post-game arguments, I actually found myself defending it. This is not because the game was perfect, because it wasn't. It's pretty clear that it was released before it was really done. But in between all of the things it did wrong, there were a few things that it did right and that I hope the series continues to do in the future. To understand these things, I'm going to talk a bit about fantasy fiction, and to do that, I'm going to talk about the person that many consider to be the father of modern fantasy, Tolkien. Part 1. Fiction and Applicability, and Tolkien. You probably already know about J.R.R. Tolkien. He's the guy that wrote The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings books. They were popular enough that later on they made movies out of them, and popular enough that they served as the template for an entire genre of fiction. Some people, intrigued at their success, began to poke around under the hood of the plot, and some of them wondered if the Lord of the Rings was an allegory for World War II. Maybe the ring, the device that drove the entire plot, a device both powerful and corrupting, was meant to symbolize the atomic bomb. Let's ask Tolkien himself if this is true.
Many people apply to nuclear, to the ring, particularly the nuclear bomb, don't they? I think that was in my mind, is that the whole thing is only an allegory of it. Well, it isn't.
Well, that clears that up. Tolkien did not like allegory, and he made no secret of it. In fact, he said, "I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestations, and have always done so since I grew old and wary enough to detect its presence. I much prefer history, true or feigned, with its varied applicability to the thought and experience of readers. I think that many confuse applicability with allegory, but the one resides in the freedom of the reader and the other in the purposed domination of the author. In Tolkien's opinion, even fictional events could have applicability to the thought and experience of his readers. And he wasn't the only one who thought this. Here comes a silky smooth segue. Shakespeare. Bam! Shakespeare out of nowhere. That's the best kind of segue if you ask me. You may not know this, but Shakespeare is considered a pretty big deal in the literary world. He wrote a bunch of plays, and one of them was called Hamlet. Hamlet is a play about how much Denmark's royalty loved poisoning each other. Its eponymous main character is a mopey Danish prince who's also a fan of the theater. A bit of an obnoxious fan, actually.
Speak the speech, I pray you, as I pronounced it to you, trippingly on the tongue, but if you mouth it, as many of your players do, I had as lief the town crier spoke my lines. Nor do not saw the air too much with your hands thus, but use all gently.
In this scene, Hamlet explains the purpose of drama to the actors in a traveling theater company. Could this be the voice of Shakespeare himself, using Hamlet as an author avatar to tell us his thoughts on his own profession? I sure hope so, because if Hamlet was just talking out his ass, that would be a huge disappointment. Here's one of the things he says.
Suit the action to the word to the action, with this special observance that you o'erstep not the modesty of nature. For anything so overdone is from the purpose of playing, whose end, both at the first and last, was and is to hold, as 'twere, the mirror up to nature. To show virtue her own feature, scorn her own image, the very age and body of the time, his form and pressure.
Part 2. Weren't you supposed to be talking about Dragon Age? Right, I'm getting to that. Dragon Age 2 was a bit of a departure from convention for BioWare in the plot department. If you spend 20 hours a day on the internet like I do, you may have already seen this chart. It illustrates how BioWare's games, from Baldur's Gate all the way through to today, have been following a pretty strict formula. You hail from humble origins. A devastating battle sends your quiet life spinning out of balance. The attack leaves you alone with 2 companions of magical and martial prowess, etc., etc. This template is most likely the result of their writers attempting to adapt the traditional stages of the hero's journey to an interactive format that allows for some non-linearity and player choice. There's nothing wrong with following a formula that's been proven effective, but if you follow it too often and too closely, it starts to get stale. So in Dragon Age 2, they mixed it up a bit. Instead of saving the world from an ancient evil something or other, in this game you're part of a family of refugees just trying to get by. The story takes place on a smaller scale and has a more human focus. The central conflict of that story is mages versus Templars. In the world of Dragon Age, mages are people with an inborn talent that lets them do miraculous things, but carries with it a risk of insanity that makes them a threat to the public. The Templars are the religious organization dedicated to managing this threat. The difficulty of this task demands vigilance, and vigilance can lead to excessive vigilance, which can lead to paranoia, which can lead to a feedback loop of hostility and distrust that's counterproductive to its own stated goals. This situation might remind you of similar situations in the real world, things like the war on terror or the war on drugs. This isn't because Dragon Age 2 is an allegory for either of these things, it's because it has applicability to both of them. It's holding, as it were, a mirror up to nature. And in fantasy fiction, as distinct from other types of fiction, the mirror is showing you nature's reflection from a different angle. Your opinions on real-world issues are probably complicated by any number of things. Your social background, your political beliefs, your race, your gender, whatever. By putting these issues in a fictional universe, fantasy gives you a chance to reset your biases to 0 and look at them from a new angle. Let's look at 3 examples from the game, ranked from very effective to not so effective. Very effective, the Arishok. For many people, myself included, the Act 2 plotline involving the Qunari was a high point in the game. This was especially true of the conversations we had with their leader, the Arishok. Before the tension between the Qunari and the Kirkwallers hit the breaking point, we had a chance to learn more about their society and their philosophy by talking with the man in charge. The Arishok was well designed, well animated, well written, and well voice acted. And by talking to him, we got a sense of not only the troubling and frightening things about religious fundamentalism, but also what can make it appealing and even magnetic. We got a sense of why people would want to join up with this guy. And to me, this made the Qunari a much more engaging and interesting adversary than the Darkspawn could ever be. Mostly effective, Meredith. In Act 3, we get a chance to talk to Meredith, the leader of Kirkwall's Templars. By this point in the story, Meredith has nearly turned Kirkwall into a police state, but given how much of a danger mages pose to the public, maybe her vigilance is justified. Finally, she gets the chance to explain herself to the player, but what I heard wasn't all that reassuring. There may be a good argument to be made for strict supervision of mages, but this isn't it. To me, Meredith's arguments seemed more like demagoguery than sound reasoning. Most of them are appeals to emotion, and the rest are a grab bag of non-sequiturs. What makes this effective is that we get the impression that she's persuaded herself of her own rightness as well as the Templars. You see why she is the way she is. Generally, good characters are ones that act in accordance with human nature. And when many of these characters get together in a logically consistent setting, their behavior starts to take on familiar patterns that we recognize from real life. We get the chance to ask ourselves important questions, like what are the qualities that separate effective law enforcement from a witch hunt? And what are the ways that a witch hunt can turn into the early stages of totalitarianism? This was all so well done that I was a bit disappointed when I learned that Meredith's sword was actually that dwarven artifact from Act 1, and that it was corrupting her or something. I felt like this explanation cheapened her characterization. She worked fine as a garden variety religious fanatic. She didn't need to have an ancient evil whatsit to explain her behavior. Not so effective. Anders. At the climax of Act 3, when tensions in Kirkwall are already running high, Anders goes and blows up a cathedral. God damn it, Anders. This development was sudden and jarring, and not in a good way. Just the mechanics of it were confusing. You're telling me that, using ingredients found in sewers and caves, Anders can make a bomb that's small enough to be concealed on his person and yet powerful enough to blow up a huge stone building. I didn't even know something like that was possible in the Dragon Age universe, and to have it show up so suddenly and be such a major plot point is off-putting. The visual reference to 9/11 was also a bit too ham-fisted for my taste. The Anders bit demonstrates the risks that come with taking inspiration from real-world events. If you're not careful, it interferes with immersion, and takes our gameplay experience out of the fictional setting and drops it into a weird no-man's land somewhere between fantasy and reality. And now for Dragon Age 3. Near as I can tell, they're already in the process of making a third game. And hopefully this third game will fix the things that were bad about the last one without abandoning the things that were good. There are some hopeful signs. Supposedly, the third game is going to be about saving the world from itself. Now that's interesting. Over the course of my video game career, I've saved the world from a lot of things. Monsters, dragons, mutants, Bowser. But I don't think I've ever saved it from itself before. In the real world, it's relatively rare for a war to have one side that's clearly evil, like the Darkspawn are. Real wars usually come about as the result of some twisted, overcomplicated prisoner's dilemma that convinces the leadership of two or more countries that their best option going forward is to round up several large groups of young people, give them weapons, and send them off to kill each other. Seeing this unfold in real time would be interesting, and getting a chance to stop it could make for a great storyline. So here's my advice to the Dragon Age 3 team. Keep it real, keep it human, and don't release it until it's really done. We've already played through the BioWare boilerplate storyline 5 or 6 times. I think the RPG world is ready for something new.